Hi, and welcome to this live reading from Secrets, Lies, and Betrayals by Lynn Wood. And this is presented by Itsy Bitsy Book Bits. Prologue. A bright sun shone over the gathered crowd at Rabin Square, the very spot where Israel's Prime Minister, Yitzhak Rabin, was assassinated on November 4th, 1995, after a rally supporting the Oslo Accords. Yet today, rising from the ashes of previous attempts to find a lasting peace in the Middle East, a new agreement was to be consummated. The ancient mistrust between the two sides is illustrated by the story of Abraham, considered the father of both Judaism and Islam. God demanded Abraham sacrifice his beloved son in deference to his divine will, but the boy was spared by an angel when Abraham showed his willingness to obey God, even if it meant the loss of his precious son. Both religions agree on the basic facts, but which son Abraham bound and laid on the altar of sacrifice before the Almighty was still a matter of debate. Jewish and Christian scriptures held it was Isaac, son of Abraham's wife Sarah, his legitimate son, who was destined to be the sacrificial lamb. Islam held it was his first son, Ishmael, by the slave woman Hagar, who was offered to Allah. This day, though, was not an hour to rehash old grievances and disagreements. Today was a celebration, a long-awaited day, the progress leading up to it watched with bated breaths around the world as the often fitful, stumbling, one step forward, two steps back process towards a meaningful peace was negotiated, arm-twisted, backtracked, sidestepped until finally an agreement was reached both sides could live with and their respective governments reluctantly assented to. The man most insiders credited with the culmination of the nearly 3-year process stood slightly apart from the main diplomatic representatives. Those representatives were all smiles, anxious to take credit for the near miraculous signing of the treaty between the Jewish state, created from the ashes of war and Holocaust, and its Arab neighbors. American Senator Mac McMillan stood shoulder to shoulder with two men he now counted among his closest friends, Imam Mohammed Sharif and Rabbi Jacob Cohen. The bond between the three men was formed during late nights in well-appointed, even luxurious accommodations across the globe, seeking the tiniest scrap of common ground, refusing to give up even after heated shouting matches. They retreated more than once to their separate countries, to their own hardcore line-in-the-sand positions. It took every scrap of diplomatic skill the senator honed over his long years of public service to bring the two parties back to the negotiating table. Each man faced opposition from his own government, threats from his fellow citizens, the condemnation of the world when the talks fell apart. But each man shouldered his burdens, stared down his detractors, and returned to once again hammer out the gritty, emotion-charged details of a peace in the Middle East no one truly believed was achievable in their lifetime. Well, my friends, before we say our final farewells, I wanted to give you each a gift. Not from the United States of America, because those will no doubt be exchanged by the smiling career diplomats for the benefit of the world press. I wanted to give you these from my family and from my heart. So when you return to your homes, you have something to remember me by and to remind you of those late nights around the fire ensconced in the cabin in the Swiss Alps. Surrounded by a dozen feet of freshly fallen snow, we debated the tenets of Islam, Judaism, and Christianity. It was in these moments, I believe, we came to recognize and truly accept all men are brothers, children of a loving God. More importantly, we acknowledged, as equals in his eyes, he would be disappointed if we abandoned his important work out of misplaced pride, fear, and millennia-old grievances. He withdrew from his jacket pocket a well-worn book and, turning to the Imam, presented it. To you, my friend Mohammed, I give this Bible. It was my father's, and his father's before his, who carried it across the battlefields of Europe in World War I, and in Europe and the Middle East during World War II. It was in this Bible I took refuge when we seemed most divided, and our goals seemed to be slipping away. The Imam accepted the Christian Bible from the senator's outstretched hands. Bowing, he said, "Thank you, my friend. This Bible shall become a treasured heirloom of my family, a reminder of the work we did in Allah's holy name and of my very good friend, the very tall American senator who shares my love for him." The two men exchanged a heartfelt embrace, and then separating, the senator turned to their companion. "Rabbi, knowing your fondness for prayer beads," he began with a smile, He pulled from his pocket a rosary made of mother-of-pearl beads set in fine, heavy silver. This was my mother's, and her mother's before hers, and her mother's before hers. I carry it with me always since she placed it in my hands with her dying breath. I admit I called upon the intercession of the Virgin during our most difficult moments together. I believe those prayers were instrumental in helping us achieve what I know we all hope will be a lasting peace in this part of the world that has known so much hatred and bloodshed. You honor me, Senator, my beloved friend Mac. This rosary will also become a cherished heirloom of my family, a reminder when challenges arise, as they inevitably will, to reach out to the Virgin and ask her for her kindly intercession once more in the history of mankind. When the two men embraced, the tall American senator reached out to include the imam, one captured in an iconic photo of a brief shining moment when men put aside religious and political differences and embraced each other as brothers. The moment ended all too swiftly when the three were called to be witnesses to the historic signing of the treaty they were instrumental in negotiating. The presidents of Jordan, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and Israel stood side by side, waiting their turn to affix their signatures to the historic document. Security was understandably intense. Protests raged in other parts of the Middle East, in both Israel and the Arab countries surrounding her. The protesters, who for the most part represented a small minority of their fellow citizens, resisted the new understanding between their countries. All sides claimed they were betrayed by their leaders who sacrificed too much of the security of their own citizens in bowing to the American senator's demands. In typical American arrogance, the superpower's diplomat believed he could impose his country's view of the world on peoples with far longer and far greater histories than the upstart Americans. The three men took their places among the other witnesses, but rather than separate and join their countrymen, they remained standing side by side, unwilling, it seemed, to bring a visible end to the unity they forged. Mac looked out over the gathered crowds, only half listening to the speeches proclaiming the historic occasion and thanking the three men responsible for bringing it about. Mac located his wife, daughter, and son-in-law across the courtyard. He nodded and exchanged an amused glance with his wife, who'd watched him with proud, tear-glazed eyes. Then his focus paused to dwell on his only grandchild, a young girl of not quite 4, with waist-length white blonde curls shining in the sun. Her eyes, he couldn't see from the distance separating them. He knew to be bluer than the cloudless sky above them. Seeing she gained his attention, Lea began waving wildly in his direction, only grinning at her parents' efforts to get her to act with a little more decorum, given the gravity of the moment. Mac raised a hand to wave back, gaining the muffled laughter of his companions. "She's beautiful," the imam offered. "You are blessed, my friend. I cannot wait until my children bestow upon me the gift of grandchildren, a gift they seem in no hurry to deliver despite my gentle urgings in their direction." The rabbi laughed. "My efforts with my own children have proven equally fruitless." The three men shared amused glances and for a moment were distracted from the little girl, who was even now wriggling away from her mother's restraining hand. Laughing with triumph, she broke free and squirmed beneath the velvet rope to race across the brick courtyard in her grandfather's direction. The rabbi's sudden laughter and nudge in his direction urged Mac to turn back to where his daughter, Rachel, was now watching with a horrified expression her daughter's gleeful flight in his direction. Grinning at his two companions and waving aside his daughter's embarrassment and the security forces who seemed uncertain as to the appropriate response to the girl's interruption, Max stepped forward to sweep his unrepentant granddaughter into his strong arms. "Granddad! Granddad!" she cried, smiling, and wrapped her small arms around his neck and clung. "Lea, my angel," Mac began in response, trying to make his voice chiding but failing miserably. It was a grandfather's prerogative, after all, not to be called upon to instill discipline and appropriate behavior in his granddaughter. Grinning down at the child in his arms, he laughed when she gave him a kiss on the lips and hugged him again, as if she would never let him go, and then pulled back to wave at the two men standing next to him. He stepped forward, intending to return young Lea to her mother's always loving but currently mortified arms. Exchanging amused glances with the largely indulgent high-ranking officials whose show Lea interrupted, he thought to himself it was right the world was reminded of the beauty and promise of its youth in such a moment. For weren't the children of the world and their futures the reason they were all gathered in the first place? The blast of a single unsilenced shot rang out, shattering that hope in a bloody, calculated instant. Chaos erupted as diplomats and officials ran for cover, ushered away by the men and women trained to protect them. The cameras kept rolling, ensuring the chaotic scene already being watched by millions of viewers across the world was recorded for prosperity. There were no additional blasts of gunfire. No automatic weapons strafed the scene to cut through the stumbling crowds. The cameras, with an unerring sense for tragedy, quickly captured and focused on the first victim of the attack. Her tawny body lay still on her grandfather's chest. Her white blonde hair was stained with and provided a perfect foil for the dark red blood spreading through it. The tall senator's arms no longer hugged her slight form close. They were splayed, as was his tall, lean, 6'4" frame across the courtyard, in the place where the blood of another peace seeker was shed years earlier in a similar violent encounter. Mac never learned the potential of the day he considered his greatest political accomplishment, ended in such a dramatic and bloody fashion. A single bullet struck his young granddaughter, passed through her soft flesh and tissue before entering his strong heart, killing him instantly. Prologue. She was deathly still when Maxwell Cole lifted the young girl away from her grandfather's chest. He'd seen enough death in 3 tours of duty to recognize the senator was dead, but for the moment at least, the girl lived. For how long, it wasn't for him to say. He was no medic. It was his job to give her the best possible chance at life, even with the loss of the bright promise of peace the events of the day were built on. Not his job, he reminded himself, to dwell on the ancient hatreds of mankind. He scooped the dying child in his arms and raced in the direction of the helicopter, even now landing steps away in the courtyard. He could hear her mother's anguished screams for her daughter and fallen father. He spared a glance in the direction of her cries to see his fellow American soldiers ushering the parents to safety. At the same time, their daughter was loaded into the waiting arms of the medical personnel, reaching down to lift their small charge into the helicopter with tears in their eyes. Max jumped into the medevac chopper. He wasn't leaving her. It was a deliberate act on the shooter's part. He could have killed the senator at any time. Instead, he recognized the opportunity the girl's impromptu appearance on the scene offered and didn't hesitate to pull the trigger. Mission accomplished. The world was no doubt justifiably horrified at the sight of the little girl crumbling against her grandfather's chest, the crimson of her own blood staining her hair, her earlier innocent delight in the day stolen by just one more madman with a gun.